everyone, Niki here with the Truck Boss Show. Today we are here with Soona Lee, Director of Regulatory Compliance for EROAD. Thanks for joining us today, Soona.
Hi, Niki. Thanks so much for having me.
Today we are discussing the hours of service changes. So before we get into that, can you tell us a little bit more about your role at EROAD, Soona?
As we all know, working in trucking, it's super highly regulated, and those regulations actually don't stay static. So a lot of the policies and regulations evolve and reflect changes in kind of the operational, technical, economic, and political realities. My job is to stay on top of those changes in terms of the policies and regulations we operate within and ensure that our solution meets and complies with those requirements so that our customers using our solutions can remain safe and compliant when they are operating.
Can you tell us about the Hours of Service final rule and what are the main changes?
The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, FMCSA, their final rule on the Hours of Service changes got published in June 1st of this year. So it's been about 2 years actually in the making of this final rule. FMCSA followed that formal rulemaking process with the Advanced Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, which came out in August of 2018, where they actually asked the industry for feedback on 5 of the key areas around hours of service. And then that resulted in around 5,000 comments, public comments that were submitted to FMCSA. Then after that was the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, which actually happened around August of 2019, so a year after that. And that outlined a lot of the proposed changes to 5 of the key areas that they started off mentioning. Now, the final rule that we saw in June of this year had 4 key changes, which means one of them actually got dropped off. So the one that got dropped off was around the split 14-hour provision, which is where a single off-duty rest of up to 3 hours could pause the 14-hour driving window. And this potentially meant a driver's work shift could extend out to about 17 hours. Now, although the agency continued to acknowledge that this duty split proposal offers a lot of flexibility, there are some key issues around, driver protection, but also there are unintended consequences around the adverse impacts to the driver's sleep patterns. And so those kind of major concerns have led the agency to decide against having this one in the final rule. So there are only 4. So what are those 4? Now, those 4 are changes to the short haul provision, the changes to the adverse driving conditions exception, and the 30-minute rest break rule, and the split sleeper berth rule. So those are the 4 key changes. Now, to go into those a little bit more in detail, I'll start off with the short haul exemption. So currently with the short haul exemption, any driver that operates in short haul must fulfill these criteria. And the criteria are: 1, they must stay within a 100 mile radius of where they started their shift. They must return back to the same location that they started. So it's a starting and end location must be the same. And they must fulfill their shift within 12 hours of coming on duty. And they must not drive for more than 11 hours. And if they do meet all this criteria, then the driver does not have to keep a record of duty status. So they don't have to keep a log at all. They don't need to keep an ELD. They're a time card driver. They actually don't need to keep anything for roadside inspections at all. And they don't have to take a 30-minute rest break. Now, the final rule expands on the short haul provision. And it says that instead of a 100 mile radius, the radius expands to 150 mile radius. So there is more leeway for the driver in terms of where they can operate. And secondly, in terms of the 12-hour shift, that expands out to 14. So the driver has 14 hours in which to fulfill their daily shift. And the other parts remain the same. So the driver, there's clearly going to be more drivers that can fulfill the conditions for short haul without breaching them. And also there may be more drivers that doesn't need to keep a rod or need to keep an ELD because the expansion to the exemption as well. With the second of the changes is the adverse driving conditions exception. So under the current rules, it's only allowed for the dispatcher to make the call on whether the driver can apply for the adverse driving conditions exception or not, based on what they knew at the start of the run. Now, this changes under the final rule where both the driver and the dispatcher is allowed to apply the adverse driving conditions if those conditions were not known or could not have reasonably be known at the time of the start of their driving or dispatch, which is a really broader definition and allows for more flexibility for the driver as well. Now, also under the current adverse driving conditions exception, when a driver encounters that situation, they had 2 more extra hours of driving, but their shift did not expand. So they had to fulfill 13 hours of driving within 14 hours. Now that's really hard to do. Whereas under the final rule, the 11 hours of drive expands to 13, but also the 14-hour shift goes up to 16. So they have a total of 13 hours of driving that they can do within 16 hours. And I think that's a really good thing for those drivers that are driving through, adverse driving conditions during wintertime, or even, things that they could not have been foreseen at the beginning of the day. So the third of the changes is around the 30-minute rest break. And currently, a driver must take a 30-minute rest in an off-duty or sleeper berth status after coming on duty for 8 hours. So on-duty time counts towards that 8 hours today. Now, with the final rule, that 30-minute rest break can be taken in an on-duty, off-duty, or a sleeper berth status. And that's a really big deal. So especially those drivers that do things throughout the day that are breaking up the drive time, like fueling or loading or unloading, can now qualify for that 30 minutes of qualified rest break. The 30-minute rest break must be taken after 8 hours of consecutive driving. So it's 8 hours of cumulative driving. And so, for example, if a driver stops their shift and does a 15-minute pre-trip, that used to count towards the 8 hours before you had to take a break. Now, under the final rule, that 15 minutes of pre-trip does not count. So it's at the first start of the drive time when the 8 hours starts counting. And so there's that extra flexibility that the 30-minute rest break changes brings. And I think based on an industry survey that we did prior to the notice of proposed rulemaking, what we noticed is this is an area where there's a lot more flexibility for the driver, because anytime a driver fuels their truck or the driver will load or unload, those on-duty not driving times can fulfill a 30-minute rest break. Yeah, and finally, this is a big one. It's the changes to the split sleeper berth rule. And so currently a driver can only split their 10-hour rest within 8 hours of sleeper berth time, accompanied by 2 hours of off-duty or sleeper berth time. So they can only do it in an 8-2 split, is what the industry will call it. Now, with the final rule, that changes in 2 ways. One is that instead of only an 8 and a 2, you can do it in a 7 and a 3. So you can do a 7 hours or more in the sleeper berth, adding with a 2 to 3 hours, depending on what you did. So there's a little bit more flexibility about how you can split your time. But also, although in the current rules, the 2 hours did count towards the 14. So it was counted as part of the 14-hour shift, whereas in the final rule, the 2 and the 3 are excluded from the 14-hour shift. So it gives the driver a longer period of time in order for them to finish their shift. And I think that's a huge flexibility for the drivers that are out there that have a sleeper cab and that they can utilize.
What are the benefits of these changes for long-haul drivers?
Yeah, absolutely. Overall, the hours of service final rule offers a lot of flexibility for all commercial drivers planning their day. In particular, for long-haul drivers that have drives across the country, or they're utilizing their sleeper cabs, the key changes that will benefit the drivers, I think, are the split sleeper berth changes, as well as the 30-minute rest break. and potentially the adverse driving conditions as well. But I think the 30-minute and the split sleeper berth are the key ones that can benefit the long haul drivers. And here's why. I think one of the biggest challenges that a driver faces out on the road is planning for when they can come to a stop and take a rest. Now, we have heard from drivers and carriers out there of the challenges in finding a truck park that is available. And now there are more facilities that you have to pay for. And so finding a place to fulfill that 30-minute off-duty rest break was really, really difficult. But if you could take that rest, let's say, while you are fueling, which can take up to 30 minutes, right? Or when you are loading and unloading, and you're just able to, not be driving, but break up that drive time, then you're in your natural course of your day, you're able to fulfill that rest break. That's a huge win for the long haul driver. As well as the split sleeper berth, where when you run into a situation where there's congestion or traffic, now you can actually have the flexibility to take a 3 hours rest or 2 hours rest, and that doesn't count towards your 14-hour shift. That's a huge win for a long haul driver in terms of how they can plan their day to meet that delivery time without being pushed back due to it's like I have to be in traffic to make my run. I think that's a huge win for those long haul drivers.
When will it take effect, and could that date change?
So the final rules are scheduled to take effect on September 29th of this year, and no, not any time before that. So it's a one-off date for all enforcement as well as carriers and drivers to go under the new changed rules. Now, any part of the rulemaking process will comprise of any petitions for reconsideration. And there have been some already made, and FMCSA are potentially considering those that have been submitted and are looking into them. Now, also, we've seen that there have been bills such as the Invest in America bill that got passed through the House that contain provisions to delay the implementation of these hours of service changes. Now, there's still a lot of steps and hurdles along the way for this bill, including going through the Senate process. But in terms of the timing of this bill, it's also unlikely for it to impact that September 29th. And what we've heard and seen from Administrator McMullen from FMCSA, as well as the FMCSA's officials, is that they are full steam ahead in making this implementation go. So for us, I think we need to start, preparing for this, even though there may be a chance. I think there's a slim chance of this, but from what we've heard about the industry, where there are some huge wins in here in these changes. So prepare for the date, September 29th, which before that is going to be all the rules, all the logs will be processed according to the old rules, and from the September 29th, it will be according to the new rules. So I think it's going to be a huge thing, and we just have to prepare.
As an ELD provider, what are you doing about these changes?
Since the time when the notice of proposed rulemaking, advance notice of proposed rulemaking, we've been staying on top of what FMCSA's thinking have been around these proposed rules and changes. And so we have to consider what this means, because in reality, many drivers out there are utilizing an ELD, an electronic logging device, that has hours of service changes incorporated to guide them through their day. So whatever they do with their duty status, it prompts the driver how many hours are remaining before they have to take a rest break. A certain type of rest break will reset their times. And so we've built that into our system, and we need to make sure that when these changes take effect, that those changes are reflected in our system as well, to make sure that the drivers can stay compliant. So we have been doing a lot of the development work behind the scenes, as well as testing that those scenarios that a driver will go under. So we've been working really closely with our customers and our drivers to understand what it is that they're doing. For instance, we've actually looked at our data around what our drivers are doing. For example, around split sleeper berth, we realized that there are a lot of drivers that do that in our system today. And for example, it's interesting to see that there are around a third of drivers that roll their split sleeper time. So for example, they go 8-2, 8-2, 8-2, and they don't take a 10 hours. They just continue to roll. Whereas about 2/3 will actually do a one-off. So they do a 10 hours and then they do an 8-2 and then they do another 10. So these are the kind of things that we see, and we test those scenarios out when we have the changes come out. So what would it look like if it was a 7 and 3? What would it look like if they do a 7-3 and then an 8? And so those are the kind of scenarios that an ELD provider has to go through and make sure that, come September 29th, there are 2 sets of data that we have to process to. So for example, up until September 28th, on the back end, as well as to the driver, we have to process the driver's duty status changes according to the old rules. And then from September 29th at midnight for the driver's time zone, we have to process to the new rules. And so how do we present that nicely? How do we make sure that the driver knows what they're seeing? How do we make that easier for the drivers and guided through the day? So those are some of the things that we think about as an ELD provider to make sure that when these changes take effect, that it's seamless and easy from a driver perspective, to make sure that they stay in compliance and they know that they can trust it. So
what can carriers and drivers do to successfully prepare?
Yeah, I think that's really key. In terms of a carrier and a driver, there are things with these changes. There are still considerations from a carrier perspective to think about what other company policies that you will like to instill. So for example, with the short haul expansion, there are some of the carriers that will realize, oh, actually, my drivers do not need to be using an ELD, but do you still want to maintain that as a company policy? Do you need to have that type of data, or to have the data in another way? And so there are company policies that may need to get updated to reflect some of these changes and how you would like to operationalize it with your drivers. And also, for example, adverse conditions as well. Who makes the call on who can utilize adverse conditions? Is it the carrier or the driver, and in what situations? So those are some of the things that they would want to think about and implement in terms of company policies. From a driver perspective and through driver training, one thing we noticed when we asked the industry around these hours of service changes was that they said, yeah, training, it shouldn't take us too long to get our drivers familiar with these changes because we're relying on an ELD. So it's important to realize that, practice will make it perfect. And so especially those operational scenarios where a driver is doing something and they want to know what it looks like on an ELD, those transitional periods where you need to understand what you're seeing and how you're going to see these new rules is going to be really important. And so it's good to go through those real world scenarios. And what we've been doing is we have a training manager, Susan Rosinski, who's actually been going through that, those types of real world situations of a driver and working through that from our device perspective. And she's able to go through and share some of her learnings and lessons of utilizing some of those scenarios in our device. And I think that's really key to be able to work with an ELD provider and understand what will it show if a driver did this, and to be able to get that type of training material from an ELD provider. So I would say if you are a carrier wanting to work through this and to be able to train your drivers, work with the ELD provider to get this type of content and to ask for this type of material to see how you can prepare your drivers and to be ready for these changes.
Now, here is Susan, training manager of EROAD, sharing one of those quick tips.
Something that I wanted you to know that may be confusing, because it was confusing to me. So right now, this drive screen counter counts down when I start my day, telling me when I need to take a break. So the counter stopped when I was testing, and I thought that was interesting. I thought that the drive screen counters were broken. So they're not broken. It's just different. So I wanted you to know, when the new rules take effect September 29th, your brake counter will only count down time after you've driven. So you only need to take a 30-minute rest break after 8 hours of driving. So make sure your drive screen counter and your brake compliance counter is only counting down the time you drive. Another thing, so when I take my break, it can be in off duty or on duty. So after September 29th, the counter will reset to 8 after you've taken a 30-minute consecutive off-duty, sleeper berth, or on-duty period. So make sure whatever system you're using, you know what your break counters are doing and that they're only counting down after you have driven.
So we have a webinar with the Acting Administrator for Enforcement at FMCSA, Joe DiLorenzo, on August 27th. We will be going over more of those in-depth questions around what can the carriers and the drivers do to prepare for these changes, and to go into some more tough questions around what will it look like for enforcement? What will it look like for the carriers that are working and operating in this manner? So yeah, I think tune into that webinar and have your questions prepared to ask Joe. I think he is super knowledgeable about what you can do as a carrier and a driver to make sure that you are ready and to make sure that you can remain compliant when these changes take effect.
Where can individuals go to partake in that webinar?
Yeah, it is a webinar through the Transport Topics,
Okay.
and so there will be promotional materials that are out there, but also if you reach out to EROAD, we will be able to get you the details to sign up.
Huge thanks to Soona Lee and Susan of EROAD for providing that demonstration, and you should all heed warning and prepare for those hours of service changes, and make sure you go check out that webinar. That's it for this segment of the Truck Boss Show. We'll see you on the next one.